Hello everyone, this is Mohammed Tuhami from Midway Simplicity and welcome to a new episode of the Midway Simplicity Show where I invite simple living advocates to share with you a few tips that are not too harsh for your lifestyle and at the same time can help you simplify the five most important areas of your life, which are time, health, things, finances and relationships. And today I have a very special guest. He's one of the stars in the simple living circles.
Yes.
He is Joshua Becker from becomingminimalist.com, author of several books, including his brand new book, Living with Less, An Unexpected Key to Happiness. Welcome, Joshua. It's an honor to have you on the call today.
Yes, you can stop. It is a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much for doing these shows and helping people out in this way. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Joshua, I believe you have a very interesting story about a transformational point that happened in your life that led to this minimalist movement that you are leading now. So I would like you to share it briefly with our viewers today.
Sure. And just to be clear, you said the minimalist that I'm living, not leading, right? You said the journey that I'm living, not leading.
Living and leading, because you are launching a
Yeah.
newsletter these days, and you are leading a movement and so on. So yeah,
I gotcha. Trying to do my best. Trying to
yeah.
do my best. No, my story goes is I was just hanging out on a Saturday afternoon. I was cleaning out my garage where I was living in Vermont, and I had stacked up a number of the possessions from my garage out in the driveway. My son was 4 years old at the time, and he was off in the backyard playing by himself, asking me to come and play with him. I was, of course, stuck cleaning the garage out at the time, and so struck up a conversation with my neighbor who just noticed, what was happening, and talked about how much our stuff seems to own us at times in our lives. And she's the one who said, "Well, my daughter's a minimalist, and she keeps telling me I don't need to own all this stuff." And I looked at my son in the backyard. I looked at my possessions in the driveway, and just the juxtaposition of the two things was so apparent to me. How much of my resources, time, energy, money, had been going to my possessions rather than my children. I mean, rather than the thing that I valued the most. And like a light bulb went off as just to how much my possessions were really robbing me of true life.
Yeah, that's a very inspiring story, I believe. And let's move into um, the first thing that you have done when you had this transformation. What
Hmm.
is the first thing that came to your mind? How did you start pursuing this simple living transformation in your life? Because it's not easy, and when you think of, yes, I will start to become a minimalist, I will simplify my positions, I will get rid of everything. So this seems to be a very huge step to take, and sometimes you face a lot of internal and external resistance. So
Hmm.
what you personally have done to make the process easy? What's the first thing that you did?
Sure, I'll try and answer that. The first thing that I did was I went in and told my wife about my conversation, and I said, "Do you think? What do you think? What are you hearing here? It seems to me like this is something we should do." And she agreed. She, of course, was cleaning the inside of the house, so she agreed with me. I said, "Well, let me go look it up a little bit online." So I went online and I began meeting minimalists, not like face to face, but just reading some of the stuff that they were writing. And I discovered a lot of people living minimally, but they were all doing it a little bit differently. So a guy was traveling and moving every 3 months. A couple had moved to a small house in Portland. A couple had moved on to live in a farm, like community with other people. And I was reading about what they were saying, and they all were loving the idea of it, but they were all working it out a little bit differently based on what they want to do with their lives. And so at that moment, while I never would have said I wanted to be minimalist and own nothing, I certainly wanted to get the possessions and the clutter out of my life that were distracting me from the most important thing. So we kind of decided, well, we don't know what that's going to look like, but we can start heading down that road and figure it out the closer and closer we get. So literally, we started with the easiest possible things that we could think of. Of course, the story goes, I was cleaning out the garage, so my cars were out of the garage. So when I pulled my cars back in, I went through my vehicles and I pulled out everything that old maps and old CDs and sunglasses and kids' toys, and just pulled all those things out of my vehicle. And that was like the first thing that I minimized was my car. And after that, we did more easy things, the living room, some of the easy clothes in our wardrobe, just started easy. And as we built momentum then and began to figure out what that was going to look like, we were able to get to some of the tougher areas and the tougher things to declutter.
Super, super. So, what tip do you have to share with us to simplify our time?
Um, Well, I would start with own less stuff. But I
Makes
do
sense?
believe that, yes, I do believe that, that our possessions take far more time out of our schedule than we realize, and far more of our mental capacity than we realize. And we did find a lot more time in our day just getting rid of the things that we no longer needed. But as we did that, we began clarifying what things were most important to us. Kids, my career, not for the money's sake, but because I invest into other people. And so these things became very important to us, and they began being elevated in our pursuits. And when they had time to rise to the top, it was much easier to then fit the important things into our schedule. We knew that, we knew when the kids would be home from school, and so we're spending time with them and just planning out blocks of the week, blocks of the day, to center our time on the things that we value the most, as opposed to having a whole bunch of other commitments that aren't adding. Not only are they not bringing joy to our lives, but they aren't contributing to anybody else as well.
Yeah. So what about health?
For me, interestingly enough, my health changed considerably after becoming minimalist, and began focusing on the foods that I was eating a lot more. Certainly started exercising more as well, but for me, the biggest change just came with thinking through the food that I was eating and taking time to choose healthy foods, as opposed to the processed food that you get at the grocery store or the fast food restaurants, and just concentrating on what food was going into my body was probably the biggest health change that we have made. And really, it's one of the easiest changes to make for people too. So
Yeah, it's very interesting that the people who are approaching a simpler life, it's like naturally or automatically they focus on what goes inside their physical body on terms of good foods, you know. So what specific tips that you do to have, because there is it's famous about this type of healthy food that they are not tasty.
mm.
So, how do you do that? How do you approach simplifying the or um, improving the kind of food that you're eating?
um, Interestingly enough, I found that I particularly liked healthy foods. Just yesterday at the dinner table, I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, and we were kind of going through the different vegetables that we liked, and they had like two, corn and potatoes or something, and I was like, you know what? I like carrots, and I like broccoli, and I like, just going down this list of all the fruits and vegetables that I liked. I just didn't know that I liked them until I started eating them. But for taking our kids, for example, who don't particularly enjoy vegetables, there always is a part of giving them new ones or experimenting with different ways to make it, different ways to prepare different foods and to find different ones that they like, but also just focusing on the ones that they do like and being sure to serve the vegetables that they like, and kind of keying in on some of the foods that we already do like, that also prove to be healthy, as opposed to thinking I have to recreate everything. Play into the foods that you already like to eat.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. So now to the things or the stuff that we own. What's a practical tip, maybe one that you have already experimented with before, to help declutter our stuff?
Sure. The most helpful advice that I think people find is in setting limitations. When you set a limitation, you are forced to define what is most important out of the things that you have. And this pertains to everything. And I get into this a lot when people ask me about kids and what do I do about my kids' toys and all their stuff. And I say, find a limiting factor, whether it's, two shelves in their closet, or one toy box, or one cardboard box full of their art things they bring home from school. As you set the limitation, then you begin asking yourself some difficult questions that you wouldn't normally ask yourself if no limitations existed. And this can go on for anything. Clothes is a perfect example. So we have closets that fit 200 articles of clothing, and so we keep 250 articles of clothing in our closets, when we'd probably be content with 75, 50. Courtney does the 33 items. And so I say, set a limitation. Say, I'm going to own 75 pieces of clothing, and then pick out your favorite 75 and get rid of the rest, or what that pertains to anything that you want to do, physically speaking. And I think people find a lot of value in that. And they get down to 75 things, they figure out they need 80. Well, that's okay. 80 is still better than 250. So that's what I tell
Yeah,
people.
yeah. That's the midway approach. In fact, it's not radical, it's not the extreme. Just pick up the limitation that you feel good with. And the interesting thing about simplicity, in fact, is that when you start simplifying, you get addicted to it. You would love to
Yep.
simplify more and more. So if you move down from 200 to 150, you will find that you want to get to 100, then to 50, then
Mm-hmm.
so to the
Yep.
minimal, because you feel the
Yep.
impact it has um, on your personal, on your mental life, in your emotional life, in your everything. You will feel it's more inner peace, more space. So yeah,
Absolutely. Absolutely. You begin to realize how much time and energy we're going into the things that you own, and rather
yeah.
than pursuing the things you love the most. So good call.
So now to the most interesting part, which is finances. How to
Hmm.
save money and how to control your finances, keeping your bills small and so on.
Yeah. You know, I I don't know if this appeals to your audience too well. It's going to depend on. I'm not sure who reads your site already, so maybe they're already doing this stuff. But I generally tell people that there are three areas that people get into the most trouble, financially speaking. They buy too big of a house. The mortgage, the bank tells them they can spend this much on a house, so they go spend as much as they can, and they get stuck under these mortgage payments with no flexibility to do anything else in life. So they buy too big of a house. They they exchange their cars too often. So they have a car, they want a new one in 4 or 5 years, they sell it in, they get a new one, they pick up a little car loan to offset the cost, as opposed to just driving a car for 10 years and being content with it and then choosing another one. And then the third thing that people do is going back to the health one, they eat out too often, or they also spend not just a lot on food, but a lot on alcohol and those types of things, that they just ring up that bill at the restaurant a couple times a week, and it just saddles them with payments, credit card debt that they can't get out of. And so generally when I'm talking to someone not in the simplicity field, outside of it, the struggles with money, I usually say, there's probably one of those three things or three of those three things that are really, resulting in you not being able to get ahead financially.
Wow, that's very, very interesting. I think you hit a hot nerve here
Oh,
because
good.
yeah, it makes a lot of sense to a lot of people, I believe, and I hope it's a wake up call to start controlling these three areas as much as you
Yeah.
can. Yeah.
Yeah. I
So
mean, there's others, but those seem to be the biggest ones for a lot of people.
yeah. And what about relationships? Because sometimes I think people may, when they are obsessed about simplicity, they can enter fights with the
Okay.
people that are very close to them, because
Hmm.
they do not buy in the idea of simple living, so they are my enemy now. In fact, they are you, maybe your spouse, your kids, your parents, whatever. Uh, so, what's your approach to have uh, simple relationships and approaching simplicity without having to involve everyone around you in the same journeys? So,
Yeah, great question, by the way, and one that I even ran into even in my own family. Even we were talking a little bit before this started, some of those issues. But I always say that my wife and I were both on board for minimalism, and she maybe wanted to go in 60% of the way, and I wanted to go in 80% of the way, and so we were fine until we got to 61. 61%, and I had another 20% of things I wanted to get rid of, but she was happy with where we were. And for a little while it became a little bit of a strife between us and trying to sort out what we were going to do. And ultimately it just comes down to compromise. My wife and I, in any relationship, rarely do you agree on everything all across the board. There's always a few things that you disagree on a little bit, even if it's just degree or level of disagreement, and then you compromise. You stay committed to one another, you love one another, you show grace to one another and patience, and you find common ground in there moving forward. And so the same is true with a non-spouse, a friend that doesn't like your journey, or you see them going down the road of accumulating possessions, and you've begun getting rid of yours, and you're like, man, there's a better way to be doing life. You love them and you show patience, and I think the light bulb doesn't click for everybody, but even the light bulb that does flip on always flips on at different times in our lives. And I was 33 when finally it made sense to me. There's, Joshua Milburn talks about when he was 30 and it made sense to him. There's other people writing that are in their 20s and it makes sense to them. So it always flips at different times. And I think we just live lives that invite others to live with less as opposed to forcing them, which we couldn't ever do anyway.
yeah, that's a very interesting insight. So, tell us a little bit about your new book, Living with Less: An Unexpected Key to Happiness. So, what's the core idea of that book?
Sure. I'll start by mentioning the first book that we wrote, which is called Simplify, and we wrote that about 2 years into our journey, and we base it on the story that I told of the things in the driveway and my son, and how it was just distracting us from important things, and it's resonated very well with people. And I like to say that parents particularly enjoy it. They can see themselves in that story, and so the idea of living with less really resonates with their heart, and a lot of them make some changes in their life. But I've worked my whole life with students, high school, college age students, and I really wanted to write a book that hit that generation with the idea of living with less before they bought the big house and the fancy cars and picked a career just for money. And so this book is written for high school students and it's written for college age students on the idea of minimalism, and it really introduces them to it. The other thing that this book is different about is it's pretty religious in its nature. I've worked at Christian churches my entire life, and Jesus's teachings on minimalism have always been pretty influential in my own exploration of it. And so this was the first book that I was able to write that got into some of those specifics about, hey, this is what Jesus was telling us, 2,000 years ago. And a lot of the religious figures, most of the religious leaders were saying a lot of the same things, and encouraging us to own less. But this one kind of keys in on some of the things that Jesus said, and then uses that to introduce the topic to a younger audience. If that explains it pretty well.
Yeah, that's amazing. So it's you are saving them from getting into the trouble. You are just picking them before they get into the corporate world and the material,
Mm-hmm.
the consumerism, yeah, the excessive consumerism that's hitting the world by taking the world by storm. So you
Mm-hmm.
are saving them from all that. That's their unexpected key to happiness if they are searching for it, to live with less,
Exactly.
yeah, and follow their passion. So yeah,
Exactly. Exactly.
that's awesome. So yeah, what can I say? I really enjoyed this call and having the
Ah,
time to
good.
chat with you. And I would love you to conclude this call with a final tip to those who are watching us now.
The final tip is to go get rid of something. The final tip is to sit down and think, okay, what do I really want to accomplish with my life, and then what do I have to get out of the way so that I can actually accomplish that. I don't sit across the table from anybody who says, well, my biggest dream in life is to own as much stuff as possible. And yet, so many of us live our lives, with that as the goal unintentionally, rather than really focusing on what is really most fulfilling for us and for the people around us.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much, Joshua, and I hope to have you again to talk in more details about your book, Living with Less, which I predict that it will become a bestseller in the most popular bookstores online and offline.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Congratulations. Thank you so much.
At the time, and he was off in the backyard playing by himself, asking me to come and play with him. I was, of course, stuck cleaning the garage out at the time, and so struck up a conversation with my neighbor who just noticed, what was happening, and talked about how much our stuff seems to own us at times in our lives. And she's the one who said, well, my daughter's a minimalist, and she keeps telling me I don't need to own all this stuff. And I looked at my son in the backyard. I looked at my possessions in the driveway, and just the juxtaposition of the two things.
Hello, everyone. This is Muhammad Tuhami from Midway Simplicity, and welcome to a new episode of the Midway Simplicity Show, where I invite simple living advocates to share with you a few tips that are not too harsh for your lifestyle and at the same time can help you simplify the 5 most important areas of your life, which are time, health, things, finances, and relationships. And today I have a very special guest.
Uh,
He's one of the stars in the simple living circles.
yes.
He is Joshua.
Was so apparent to me how much of my resources, time, energy, money, had been going to my possessions rather than my children. I mean, rather than the thing that I valued the most. And like a light bulb went off as just to how much my possessions were really robbing me of true life.
Yeah, that's a very inspiring story, I believe. And so let's move into um, the first thing that you have done when you had this transformation. what
Hmm.
is the first thing that came to your mind? Becker from becomingminimalist.com, author of several books, including his brand new book, Living with Less, An Unexpected Key to Happiness. Welcome, Joshua. It's an honor to have you on the call today.
Yes, you can stop. It is a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much for doing these shows and helping people out in this way. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Joshua, I believe you have a very interesting story about a transformational point that happened in your life that led to this minimalist movement that you are leading now. So I would like you to share it briefly with our viewers today.
Sure. And just to be clear, you said the minimalist that I'm living, not leading, right? You said the journey that I'm living, not leading.
Living and leading, because you are launching a
Yeah.
newsletter these days, and you are leading a movement and so on. So yeah,
I gotcha. Trying to do my best. Trying to
yeah.
do my best. No, my story goes is I was just hanging out on a Saturday afternoon. I was cleaning out my garage where I was living in Vermont, and I had stacked up a number of the possessions from my garage out in the driveway. My son was 4 years old